Chapter 12. The tumult had now nearly subsided. The late busy crowd had flown, uttering shrieks of horror and dismay, and all of the countless mass of human beings that had so lately thronged around. None now remained but Edmund and Father Morris, who supported Claudia and the Duke and Henry Seymour, who still remained near the insensible form of Elvira. The eyes of all chained, as though by magic, upon the horrid vision before them, whilst they, pale and immovable as a sculptured marble of the tomb, waited in fearful expectation of what was to happen next, and scarcely dared to move or breathe, the solemn silence that prevailed being broken by the convulsive gasps of the expiring queen. An awful change from the busy hum of thousands which had so lately filled the air. "What am I?" exclaimed Cheops, gazing wildly round, in his deep, sepulchral voice thrilling through every nerve. "Where is Asenue? Where is she? They seize her. They tear her from me. Curse on the ring. May Typhon's everlasting vengeance pursue them with its fury, and may their hearts wither gnawed by the never-dying snake." The mummy gnashed his teeth as he spoke, and the gloom that gathered on his dark brow grew black as night. All shuddered at the horrid glance of eternal hatred seemed to freeze their blood. They turned away involuntarily, and when they looked again, the spectre had disappeared. The shattered remains of the balloon lay before them, for happening to cross London just at the moment of the greatest confusion, it had become entangled in the crowd, and, notwithstanding the strong material of which it was composed, had been rent asunder in the scuffle, and had fallen with its fearful occupier to the ground. "Good God!" cried Father Morris after a short pause. "What a horrid vision! What can it mean?" "It seemed an Egyptian mummy," said Edmund, shuddering, "and it spoke that language, but what can have resuscitated it? What human power can have recalled to life a being so longly immured in this silent tomb?" "Perhaps the vehicle he came in may contain something to explain this mystery," said Henry Seymour. At this moment several persons ran past, screaming in terror, and exclaiming that they had seen a demon. When the confusion excited, these trembling fugitives had little subsided. A few of the courtiers began to take their appearance, and return to their posts near the queen. But all were pale, and they started at every sound, seeming ready, at the least alarm, to take flight again as expeditiously as before. Claudia still lay insensible, her chest heaving in deep convulsive sobs for breath, alone betraying signs of life. But her fate no longer excited the deep, overwhelming interest it had done before. Whispers of wonder and superstitious horror mingled with the hopes and fears inspired by her danger, and her removal to the palace was almost regarded with indifference, so completely were the minds of men occupied by the strange spectacle they had so lately witnessed. Everyone, indeed, neither thought nor spoke of anything but the mummy, and 1,000 rumors, each more extravagant than the last, spread from mouth to mouth respecting it. Men stood in groups whispering to each other, and scarcely daring to stir without a companion, nay, even then, creeping from place to place, looking cautiously round and starting at every noise, as though they feared the awful visitor was returned. Whilst the sages of the country gravely shook their heads and declared that what had taken place was evidently a visitation from heaven, in punishment to the sins of mankind. An indefinable presentiment of evil hung over the spirits of all. Gloom, indeed, spread through every class of society. All dreaded they knew not what, and all shrunk with horror from the thought of supernatural agency. There is an invisible feeling implanted by nature in the mind of man which makes him shudder with disgust at anything that invades her laws. The body of the queen being removed, attended by her physicians and the ladies of her household, the rest of the assembled courtiers gathered round the balloon, and examinations of terror and surprise broke from their lips when they discovered it to be the same which Edric and Dr. Edworfen had so short a time before taken on their departure to Egypt. The whole truth now seemed to flash upon them. "I thought, how would it be?" said Lord Smayersworth. "You know I told you, Lord Gustavus, that in my opinion it was an expedition that could possibly never go any good. But you were in different belief." "My lord," returned Lord Gustavus solemnly, "thinking as I think, as I am convinced every one who hears me must think, or at least ought to think, it is my deliberate opinion that the expedition of my youthful friend and his learned tutor was both admirably planned and well concocted, and that it had failed in its ulterior object. It has been solely owing to some of the unforeseen events which sometimes do occur even in the best regulated arrangements, and which it is utterly impossible for any human ability entirety to ward off and avert." "Edward's balloon! Impossible!" cried Sir Ambrose, rushing forward to ascertain the fact, and forgetting all his anger against his son, for his anxiety of his fate. "Yes, yes," he continued, looking at some of the things, as they were drawn forth and exhibited by different persons in the crowd. "Those are Edric boots. That was his desk. Oh, my son, what has become of him?" Many sympathized with the unfortunate father, and more eagerly questioned each other as to the probable meaning of what they saw. No one, however, could give any explanation, and all was confusion and dismay. The bosom of Edmund, after the first moment of excitation had passed, was racked with anguish too bitter to allow him to feel curious even to know his brother's fate. But a few hours before, love and fortune seemed to unite in showering their choicest blessings upon his head. Now he was the most wretched of mankind, for if Claudia died, Elvira or Rosabella would be queen, and if Elvira should be chosen, all hopes of becoming her husband must be lost. "Oh, God!" he cried, striking his forehead in agony. "Why was I reserved for this? Why did not perish fighting in the battles of my country? Why was I saved only to be mocked with this hope of happiness, which, just as it seemed within my grasp, flies from me forever? Wretch that I am! Would that I had been never born, or at least had died in the nurse's arms, and thus escaped this tormenting pangs that now drive me to distraction." Whilst Edmund thus raved, the eye of Rosabella followed his every movement, and seemed with a fiend-like pleasure to exult in his agonies. "I am avenged," thought she. "He now feels what I have so often suffered. But this is not all. He must be probed to be the quick ere he can know the bitter vengeance of a woman scorned." Whilst these violent emotions were convulsing the bosoms of all around, the old Duke knelt by the side of Elvira, gazing upon her with the most intense anxiety. Her gentle and feminine nature has been overpowered at seeing the blood of Claudia, and she lay still insensible, looking more exquisitely lovely than fancy can conceive. The beauty of Elvira was almost the most soft and feminine description. Long silken eyelashes shaded her dark hazel eyes, and gave them an expression more voluptuous than brilliant, whilst nothing could exceed the delicacy of her complexion or the beauty of her full rosy lips. The figure of Elvira might not have served as a model of a courageous heroine, but it would have suited admirably as an honorary. As lovely as she always was, and she had perhaps never looked more so than at this moment, as the returning blood softly retinted her cheeks, and her eyes gradually unclosed. Lord Edmund gazed upon her still, till maddening by the thought that he must lose her forever, he could no longer endure his own sensations, and darting amongst the crowd, endeavored to fly from the world and from himself. The Duke, on the contrary, saw every recovery of his daughter with unalloyed transport, for though he loved Edmund, and wished to have him for a son-in-law, he was by no means insensible to the prospect of seeing his daughter a queen, and his breast throbbed with violent emotions which had long been a stranger to it. In the meantime, the mummy had stalked solemnly through the city, urged more by instinct than design, the mists that still clung over him, making him seem like one wandering in a dream. Yet still he advanced, his path like that of a destroyed angel, spreading consternation as he went, and all he met flying horror-stricken from his sight. Many, however, when the monster had passed, crept softly back to gaze after him, and amongst this number was Mrs. Montagu, in whose breast curiosity the vice of low minds reigned predominant. The whole family had reached in perfect safety, the lady herself hurrying in return, the moment the accident of the Queen was made known, lest, as she said, in the confusion that might ensue, her servants might be induced her to leave her house, to some evil-disposed personages might strip it of its contents. Urged by this prudent move, Mrs. Montagu had hastened home, finding all safe, as just was to retire to rearrange her disordered dress, and one of the servants rushed into the room with an account of fearful spirits that had been seen in the Strand, whose mysterious appearance, coupled with a singular accident that had happened to the Queen, seemed to portend some dreadful calamity that was about to fall upon the whole country.
"What was it like?"
asked Miss Montagu.
"Have you seen it, Evelina?"
"Oh, yes, ma'am,"
cried the panting girl.
"its eyes flare like fire, and it stares so wildly round it. Went along, it saw a dead cat lying in the street, and it knelt down and took the creature up and kissed it, and lamented over it with such a strange way and such a strange language. I never heard anything like it in my life."
"Oh, dear, I should like to see it,"
cried Miss Montagu, flying to the door and holding it half open to secure a retreat in case of necessity. Just as she reached the street, however, fate, as though willing to gratify his curiosity, occasioned the mummy to turn back, and with that kind of half pleasure, half pain, with which good people of England sometimes delight to gaze upon any horrible thing, Mrs. Montagu continued to look at it, rapidly approaching her dwelling, till, as it reached the door, to her infinite horror, it stalked towards it. Awestruck and trembling, Mrs. Montagu retreated. The mummy followed her. He stretched out his hand to her. She shrunk back aghast from his touch. "Lead on!" cried he with a voice of thunder. Mrs. Montagu could bear no more, and she fled screaming to the parlor, where her husband was already lost in some of his beloved calculations. Absent as Mr. Montagu generally was, however, he was roused by this unexpected intrusion, and the blood ran chilly through his veins as he saw the tall, majestic figure of Cheops stride across the apartment. His athletic stature, his dark, swarthy complexion, and his strongly marked features aided to the fearful luster of his piercing eyes, and gave to his figure, swathed in yet was the vestments of the grave, a supernatural grandeur that thrilled to every nerve of Mr. Montagu's frame, and he shrunk back with horror as his fearful guest stalked past him. Cheops saw his terror, and smiled in proud disdain as he threw himself upon the couch, and placed near a window looking upon the garden, which, as we have stated before, shelved down to the river. There he lay, his eyes fixed upon the majestic Thames, whilst Mr. and Mrs. Montagu gazed with trembling limbs and pallid lips at their strange guests, without daring either to approach or disturb him. "Thus I have watched the Nile," said Cheops, his awful voice sounding as from the tomb, "whilst the gentle rising waters have gradually swelled into the flood which was to pour joy and plenty over the land. And thus, too, I have lain gazing upon its streams, when the purpose of all boundless nature having been fulfilled, it has sunk back, slowly retiring to its natural bed. But oh, how different were the feelings that then throbbed in my breast to the corroding fire that now consumes me. Oh, Osiris, what horrid thoughts flash through my brain! They come like overwhelming floods, pouring from heaven to the great deep, sweeping all before them in one mighty ruin. Oh, Arsinoe, by the rights of Typhon, there's madness in the thought." Then, springing from the couch, his eyes glared with yet fiercer brilliancy as he flashed them around, whilst Mr. and Mrs. Montagu, terrified beyond the power of expression, flew towards the door, eyeing the motions of their dangerous guest with a feeling of unspeakable horror. The storm of passions in his breast of Cheops, however, though tremendous, seemed soon allayed, for ere many moments had elapsed, they sank upon the couch in a kind of lethargy, which, if it were not slumber, seemed to at least cease to imply the temporary cessation from pain. "Thank God!" whispered Mr. Montagu, as he motioned to the wife to creep out of the apartment. She tremblingly obeyed, and the moment she thought herself in safety, she threw herself upon her knees and thanked God with more fervor than she had ever done before in her whole life, whilst the servants, who were all assembled in the anteroom, crowded around her, trembling, and with pallid cheeks and white lips, clustering together like bees swarming around their queen.
"Oh, madam, madam," cried Angelina in a whisper, "what will become of us? A serious moisture transudes in every pore of my body from the chillness of death, and the very hair erects itself with horror upon my head." "And my heart throbs with such violence," said Cecilia, "that the whole arterial system seems to rage."
"It is evidently an Egyptian mummy," observed Mr. Montagu, as he seldom spoke. Every word he uttered was listened to as an oracle. "Its language and its dress bespeak its origins. But by what strange event has it been resuscitated?" In this moment a sharp knock at the door made the terrified servants all spring closer together, clinging to each other in the agony of nervous horror, and not one daring to approach the door. The knocking and ringing, however, at length became so violent as to even rouse Mr. Montagu to give his clamorous intruders entrance. It was Father Morris and Sir Ambrose. "Oh, my dear brother," cried the latter, panting for his breath, "have you heard the news? The strangest vision has appeared, and the Queen is certainly dying. Everyone says it's a demon." "What, the mummy?" asked Sir Montagu.
"Have you heard of it, then?"
said Sir Ambrose eagerly. "It's now in my house," cried Mrs. Montagu. "In the house!" repeated her brother-in-law, while Father Morris, who had looked pale and exhausted when he entered, became even paler, looking scarcely able to support himself.
To arms! Cried Cheops from the inner room. The Pally are upon us, cowards that we are. The enemy is at our gates.
Screaming and scarcely knowing where they went, the terrified servants tumbled over each other in the hastiness of their retreat, huddling themselves together in a heap, yet keeping their eyes fixed upon the door from which they expected the spectre to appear, as though charmed by the fascination of a rattlesnake. A low crash now produced a fresh scream. Then all was still. After a long pause, which seemed an endless duration, Father Morris, evidently with dreadful effort, roused himself and advanced. "Death itself is not so horrid as the suspense," he said, as he resolutely threw open the door to the room, which now contained the mummy, and entered it. It was empty, but the broken framework of the window seemed to point out the manner the awful visitor had made his exit. It was with infinite difficulty that Mrs. Montagu could be persuaded to return to the room, and when she did, the remainder of the day was passed by her and every inhabitant of her mansion in fear and trembling. When they spoke, it was in whispers, and when they moved, they crept along with stealthily noiseless steps, as though they feared the echo of their own footsteps. The eyes of all fixed timidly upon the broken window through which this fearful stranger had disappeared. Slowly and heavily the hours rolled on, till the time appointed for dinner arrived. The servants, as they served the meal, looking timidly around instead of regarding the dishes they handled with care. The family scarcely dared to eat, and only speaking whispers, whilst they started at every moment, fancying the wild eyes of Cheops once again glazing upon them, and the deep hollow voice again rang out in their ears, and their own tones sounded strangely hoarse and unnatural. Nothing, however, had terrified Mrs. Montagu so much as the laugh of Cheops. Strange, wild, and unearthly, it seemed to ring in her ears like the yell of a demon, whilst if anything that happened chanced to recall the appalling sound, her limbs shook in every joint, her teeth chattered in her head, terror blanched her lips and her cheeks into a ghastly paleness, and she seemed every instant at the point of rising from her seat and flying shrieking from the room. In the meantime, The sensations of these extraordinary events had created amongst the people were indescribable. Strange rumors and contradictory reports were circulated, and the most incredible stories invented of all that had passed. The minds of men became bewildered. They knew not what to credit nor what to think. The gloomy presentiment that hung over them, they seemed to feel some fearful change was at hand, but scarcely knew what to hope or what to fear. Business was at a stand. People indeed gathered together in the shops, but it was only to whisper secretly to each other strange, mysterious stories of the late marvelous events which they dared not breathe in public. The extremes of ignorance and civilization tend alike to produce credulity, and the wildest and most improbable stories were as greedily swallowed by the most enlightened people in the world as it could have been even by a horde of uncultivated barbarians. The family of Mr. Montagu retired early to rest at the close of the eventful day we have been speaking of, hoping to lose the sleep of remembrance of the harassing events that they had so lately witnessed. Lord Edmund had returned soon to the disappearance after the mummy, but he had locked himself in his chamber and had refused to see anyone, his mind being much too agitated for him to endure the common forms of society. All was soon quiet throughout the mansion. It was midnight when a tall figure, wrapped in a large cloak, appeared, slowly gliding with cat-like steps through the garden of Mr. Montagu. It cautiously avoided the light, and crept along the shadiest walks and thickest alleys, carefully shrouding itself from observation, and endeavoring, by availing itself to the shelter of the trees, the better to conceal its movements. It had already stated in the garden that Montagu was only separated from that of the Duke by a terrace very little used. The door, indeed, leading to it from Mr. Montagu's premises, had been so long closed up as to be nearly forgotten, and yet it was towards this unfrequented spot that the mysterious figure directed its course. The long-neglected door slowly opened. A stream of light was admitted, was obscured by a moment by a passing shade, and then all seemed dark, silent, and mysterious as before. "It certainly went that way," said a voice, as precisely which belonged to Abelard. "It was a great deal tangible material form. I saw its shadow intercept the light when the door was opened, and it passed through."
It is quite impossible,
cried Evelina, one of Mrs. Montague's housemates, who, having been induced to the constant butler take a ramble with him by moonlight, who had witnessed a strange apparition.
You must be mistaken, Mr. Abelard, for the door has not opened this age. It is even nailed up, as you may see yourself to examine it.
"It is very strange," said Abelard, after he had tried the door and found it immovable. "I certainly saw it open."
There must have been an optical delusion, Mr. Abelard, said Evelina. The retina of the eye is sometimes strangely affected, and represents objects quite different to what they really are.
"I must consult Father Morris about it tomorrow," resumed the butler, "for it was certainly the mummy spectre."
Do you think it so, Mr. Abelard? Said Evelina, turning pale. Why then didn't you speak of it?
"I will if it comes again," returned Abelard.
Oh, there it is,
cried Evelina, and the worthy pair flew back to the house, screaming in concert, and without once daring to look behind them. Scarcely, however, had the last echo of their footsteps died away to the ear, when the figure emerged through the recess for which it had lain concealed, and again crept slowly towards the door leading to the garden of the Duke. "Hist, Marianne!" he cried, pausing for a reply, but that was it. "Marianne!" replied, still louder. "Fools, dolts, idiots!" continued he, stamping violently, as he still found his call to no avail. "They've kept me so long with their cursed follower that she is gone. Eternal misery haunt them in their furious babbling. By heaven, if they had not come since climbed the wall, I had been lost. But hark, she comes!" The door now slowly opened, and a female figure holding a light appeared. "How is she?" cried the stranger.
Better,
returned the female. "Then it is past the power of man to kill her," resumed the first, and rushing wildly past her, he buried himself in the deepest recesses of the grove.